Good afternoon and welcome to OAG's final 2022 webinar. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Becca Rowland, I'm a partner at Midas Aviation. I'm going to be hosting today's webinar. The title's The New Normal, Managing Uncertainty. As we come to the end of a year where we are getting back to closer to where we used to be in aviation, there's a lot that's changed, and as in every webinar we will look at some of those things that have changed, and we're going to be looking forward to what might happen in 2023. So yeah, review of 2022, what's changed for good, and what our expectations are going forward. Do use the questions area to send your questions in as we go through. We increasingly just pick up your questions as we go through, and the panelists are very adept at answering them as we are discussing the topics. We've got two extra panelists today with us, and really good to welcome back João Peter, who's the head of airline business at Sao Paulo. Thank you for joining us again today, João.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always great to spend an hour with you, especially before Christmas. So it's a great way of ending the year.
Oh, good. That's very nice to hear. And a big welcome to Laura Morn, who we've not had before, but really good to have you join us. You're the head of worldwide airport slots at IATA, aren't you, Laura? So, yeah, lots of expertise and lots of challenges at the moment.
Yeah, Becca, thanks for having me. And as Joe said, delighted to do it at the end of the year, looking back and somewhat looking forward to next year, I think, for everyone.
Yeah, and you two know each other, don't you, through sort of slots roles? So I guess there's going to be quite a lot of discussion about slots today. Not something I think we've ever covered in the webinars before, so really good to have you both here. And as usual, we've got John Grant. In your Christmas jumper today, John, you're the only one looking really...
I know, I'm so disappointed. I thought you'd all get the same email, but anyway, the good news is I haven't taken the label out. I've only worn it twice, so I'll be taking it back to Tesco's later on.
Incorrigible, John. Okay, let's make a start. We always start with just having a look at where we've got to this year and comparing that back to 2019 in particular. I think I've made no secret of the fact I'm looking forward to the day that we don't have to compare to 2019. And the dotted line we show here is just the next few months going forward. John, do you want to talk us through what we're seeing here domestically, internationally, total numbers?
Yeah. Oh, so looks like we're going to end December and 2022 at about 4.7 billion seats, which is about 12% down on 2019, although it was slightly stronger in the second half of the year as new markets opened and we saw the recovery gather some more momentum. And that's about 30% up on last year. So, you know, it's still a significant growth. And indeed, there are some major markets where we're still seeing growth of 70, 80% year on year as they reopen and capacity comes back. If you look forward to 2023 and the first quarter, well, at the moment, it looks like we're about 7% down on capacity for Q1. But allowing for the normal sort of drift and drop in capacity that we see from airlines 3, 4, 5 weeks before travel as they refine their schedules, that will probably come back to 12%. So pretty flat, and it's been pretty flat for about the last 7 or 8 months, Becca. We've been treading that sort of somewhere between 12 and 16% shortfall against pre-pandemic levels. Domestic has performed stronger, and noticeably so this week, where we've got China back in the game with a 30% increase in domestic flights in 7 days, which is quite remarkable. Obviously, lockdown restrictions easing and changes of government policy are behind that, but we're still struggling in international markets, and particularly so in Asia, where that dependency on Chinese international traffic is pronounced, and also where some of the major leisure markets are still struggling to get the airlift and the connectivity they used to have, Thailand being an example. So it's, you know, it's not going backwards. There's no nasty events that look like they're about to loom on us in the first quarter of next year. but it's business as usual. Capacity discipline, probably softer demand for January and February. Question marks over the corporate recovery, and will there be more corporate demand as a new year starts and some businesses go looking for business. But it's it is what it is, and I think it will be 2024 before we get back to pre-pandemic capacity levels in
We've
many.
talked in the last couple of webinars, haven't we, about this capacity discipline, and actually it's sort of in all the airlines' interest to maintain that for as long as they can, really, because they can actually, they're getting higher yields as a result of that, aren't they? It's not a race to get back to 2019 levels necessarily, if that means the fares have to fall and they're struggling to make it to be profitable.
Yeah, you know, is it capacity discipline, or is it just, you know, the market conditions? Yes, airlines are putting less capacity in, but, you know, is that a function of fewer resources, a lack of aircraft, a lack of spare parts, you know, problems with engines that some airlines are having and having to put them through maintenance checks faster than originally expected? You know, airports in the United Kingdom on Sunday and Monday only having one bus driver who could go out on the ramp, and, you know, no person to de-ice the wings of aircraft because those skill sets have been lost during COVID and the last few winters have been mild. It's a combination of everything, but airlines are certainly enjoying and have enjoyed very strong yields in the last half of this year, which has helped them tremendously.
No, we're obviously showing capacity here, which is what we often do because that data is so timely and it gives us an idea of what's going forward. It says capacity rather than passenger traffic. Do you have a sense of what's happening with loads? We've had a question in from Craig Heffman saying, you know, what about passengers? What's happening with the loads? Are they lower?
Loads appear to be very strong. Notwithstanding the fact we're coming into the Christmas peak, there is a lull in demand that sort of occurs from second week of November through to Thanksgiving in the US and extends further in the rest of the world to about now when demand picks up. But the other point is, you know, if you've got higher fares in the market and you're flying around with slightly lower load factors, then your revenue is still going to be higher than it would otherwise be. And if you've not been chasing yield, then you're likely to have maximized your revenue per passenger, and your margins will still probably be better than they were otherwise. The reason the airline industry gets itself in a mess on occasions is when there's too much capacity too quickly and everyone goes hunting the $10 fare and tries to compete with Ryanair, and they can't.
Yeah. Okay, let's have a look at some specific countries. Now, in this afternoon webinar, we tend to focus on Europe and North America and the rest of the Americas and Africa and a bit of the Middle East. We have a morning webinar, which we did this morning, which focuses a bit more on Asia Pacific. Both will be available afterwards to download. So if you are particularly keen on getting information about Asia Pacific, then do have a look at that, the other webinar that we've done. But we've picked 6 countries here in Europe and the Americas just to see where capacity is on an annualized basis between 2019 and 2022. Mexico up here on the top left, 10% up on 2019. We don't have many countries that are in that situation, do we, John?
Mexico, Colombia, Kyrgyzstan, and one in West Africa, I think. And obviously Mexico and Colombia are because throughout the whole pandemic they remained open. No visa, lockdown, entry, quarantine requirements, etc. And Mexico did very well from the US leisure market during that time. Colombia, lots of low-cost capacity built in, stimulating demand, quite a bit of it domestic. And you know, you can see even in the US, edging ever closer back towards pre-pandemic levels. And I think an interesting way to look at this is if you imagine the 24-hour time zones of the world, then actually the Americas are at 0. They are ahead of everyone else in terms of time traveling. They recover quicker, they're faster back than other parts of the world, and then lagging that, you know, maybe 6 or 7 months behind that is Europe, and then probably 12 months behind that is Asia. So you can see that in this picture. You know, Brazil -11, that's not bad compared to many parts of the world, and yeah, your domestic market's fully recovered, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. I think annual figures for 22, they are always tricky to analyze, because on the first quarter we had some the last big wave of COVID in Brazil, so we had a significant drop in demand for February, March, and April, and then a recovery. So I think the last months we were in most of the leisure markets in Brazil, Northeast, Central West, and even in the North, we were up against 19. Of course, we are still missing some corporate traffic, and what you mentioned about capacity discipline, the aircraft availability, and all of that, counting, of course, on the number of seats available. But definitely on the domestic side, we are up against 19 as a country, and we have also been able to recover most of the international services. And as you mentioned, with low-cost carriers growing in South America, we are having new services even on the international side. So I think all positive news, and again, I think figures in 2022 a lot to do with the first quarter that were significantly down comparing to 19 figures.
Yeah, it's a really good point that actually we've seen progression through this year, and so a final year number doesn't tell us the whole picture.
No. And the UK is quite strong now. I mean, you know, the unfortunate thing for the UK is its two largest capacity providers, who are British Airways and EasyJet, have been best in class or worst in class in terms of recovery and re-entering the market. You know, Ryanair throughout Europe continues to steam ahead, plus 15%, 20% more capacity than 2019. EasyJet minus 15 to 20% less capacity than 2019. So the gap's widened between those two, and BA's you know, struggled to get its operation back, and it's not going to be until next year that it's back to, or near back to, full capacity. So that hasn't helped us. And similarly in Germany, Lufthansa has been slow back to the market as well. But in all of these cases, if you broke it down by quarter, the last quarter looks certainly a lot better than the first quarter of 2022.
And yeah, have the fares held up in Brazil and the rest of South America is the same as we're seeing elsewhere?
Yeah, I think that's the same everywhere. I think as John mentioned, there is a lot of reasons for that. Of course, that's good for the airlines, for the consumers, and for the airports. Sometimes not that good. We don't want to pay more to travel and to do more tourism and to go to meetings here and there. But you know, I think it's part of the business. There is the fuel, there is a crew shortage, aircraft shortage, in some of the cases, resource shortage on the handling, airport side. I think all the supply chain of the aviation is, in some cases, disrupted, and I think 2023 will most likely change the situation. But again, I think capacity discipline is really preventing some of the markets to grow faster. And the consequences are not only for the industry, right? Because if you leave from tourism, if you need more tourists to come to your region to fill your hotel rooms, then you have a problem because you don't have enough capacity to do it. So I think at some point we need either more competition or to be able to overcome the capacity discipline. So in order to grow, and people, they don't travel because, I mean, most of them, because they enjoy to travel, right? They travel for a reason, and that reason is what drives the economy to move forward.
Yeah, really, really helpful points. We're going to have a quick look at China. We don't normally look at China in the afternoon webinar because it's in Asia Pacific. It sort of goes without saying, doesn't it? But it is a very large market and responsible for, you know, certainly was a very large outbound travel market. And there's a lot of countries in Asia Pacific still waiting for Chinese travelers to come back. We still don't have a date on that, but we think it's going to happen in the next, I guess, 6 months, don't we, John? But it does affect everywhere. It's the volumes of travellers from China were much smaller to places like Europe and North America, but they're a very valuable part of the market.
Oh, extremely. I mean, you know, some of our guests this morning were saying that they expect something to happen by second half of 2023. Well, if it does, great. I suspect it might be the last quarter of 2023 before we see anything noticeable happening. But it's not just purely China, it's the impact it has on the surrounding markets. Capacity to Thailand at the moment is minus 50% of what it was 2019. Japan is minus 30. You know, and these markets are dependent, to Yao's point, for tourism, for the economic wealth of Chinese travelers coming and spending lots of money in the hotels and shops and duty-free airports as they return and they're about to gift. There's a bit of a breakthrough. We are seeing a bit more international capacity coming online as China has eased some of its quarantine requirements for returning international travellers. So there's a bit more capacity in Northeast Asia, and even in Europe we're seeing some flights, although they seem to be accommodating the returning Chinese student market for the Christmas holiday. But it's, you know, Hong Kong has removed its requirements in the last few days. Hong Kong Airport and Cathay Pacific are rebuilding their networks slowly. It will come back at some point. Now the question is going to be, how does it come back, and what does it mean in terms of volumes? Can everyone cope with those sudden volumes? Because, you know, it's going to be very difficult to just drip demand back out. It's going to flood back out, I suspect. What markets are they going to go to? Lara's ultimate boss last week, Willie Walsh, was saying, you know, it's unfair competition for the Chinese to be able to overfly Russian airspace between China and Europe. If European airlines, well, I don't know how they would get to China without sort of, again, going over the North Pole or round through Central Asia. So we need to find a way that China can re-enter the market, create demand, but in a competitive environment for everyone rather than giving them too much advantage.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. We've got our next slide, actually. Having looked at China, we were going to have a look at what the impact of the conflict in Ukraine is. And I know we've touched on this before. We saw this diagram here that I think, Lara, it was you that had posted it or shared it or something on LinkedIn. So we thought, oh, that's quite a nice diagram, but really illustrates what's happening in terms of airlines having to fly around Russian airspace. So this is a BA routing from Tokyo to London, and I believe in the other direction they're taking a very southbound route. But it's 2 hours longer than it used to be, and it plays havoc with the schedules and the slots, doesn't it, Lara? Do you want to tell us a bit more about, you know, the difficulties of managing slots in this situation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as the airlines are coming out of COVID and trying to relaunch their network between, say, Europe and Asia back into Europe, or US down to India, those countries that have implied sanctions or restrictions, their airlines are obviously suffering from this closed airspace, and adding 2 hours is probably one of the best cases at the moment. I mean, there's Finnair with, I think, 3 to 4 hours plus as well on their flight, their block times through to Asia. So it's really skewed the operation and put a heavy demand on the fleet as well as the crew, obviously, and then there's the payload impact. So it's been a huge challenge to sort of incorporate all of those moving parts as you're coming back from COVID and trying to build demand back as well. And some of these markets were restricting demand and putting caps on the passenger levels as well. But I think now, as we're seeing these markets recover, that payload issue is going to be an even bigger concern for the airlines. But coming on to the slots specifically, as you said, I mean, trying to deal with those changes in a schedule that's really, you know, pretty precisely planned and because of slot alleviation through COVID, as the foundations of that network have been in place for the airlines to build back on, they've now had to sort of work, where can they flex the schedule, which end of the route do you take the hit? And as you can probably see, I think, from that BA schedule, and it's the same for many carriers, they're not moving the parts on both ends. They're generally moving the schedule at their base because that's where they have the flexibility with their slot portfolio, and they're having to keep the slots at the same time on the other ends of the route. So in that case, BA's obviously launched a new service now, but they've got essentially the same arrival and departure times, and then they haven't got new slots for an additional service to flex how they operate in and out of Japan. And that will be the same if you flip it the other way. The Japanese carriers will take a different timing earlier out of Japan and return later, and try and keep their Heathrow slots at the same time, because there's not going to be that much room to move those schedules around as the airlines fit the schedules back together. I think this summer we've probably seen more flexibility than we're ever going to see again on these routes, because the level of flying has still been somewhat lower. So there's been a portfolio to move around the schedules within. But next summer things are going to be back at a level that probably means retiming slots on the other end is really difficult.
And yeah, when we were talking to you about this in preparation for today, you were saying that there's an impact on airlines that maybe have nothing to do with this, just because adding 2 hours to a flight route actually has an impact on aircraft availability elsewhere, that an airline might pull an aircraft off a route in order to service these longer routes.
No, definitely. I think it's the BA example is a great example. So they are using the aircraft 4 hours more on the block times, even more if they need to stay on the ground for longer periods, if that's the case. Not the case in Haneda, but might be the case in other places. And the question is, if you are already aircraft constrained and you don't have enough resources to expand, then if you are using more block times on your aircraft, especially on the long haul operations, then of course you need to drop some routes, or you need to reduce frequency to other places. So again, this is it has a world impact, it has a network effect, and maybe some places in Africa or in Latin or even in India might be suffering because some routes might reduce their capacity or even be cutted for the summer or now for the winter. So it is a world industry, so anything that is impacting Asia or Europe will impact the other regions, that's for sure. And I mean, we are all discussing slots for now a very long time in very vivid, healthy discussions about all the stakeholders, and I think we need to come up with solutions. I think new times mean new solutions.
It's interesting because we were talking this morning to Julian Carr, who's with GMR Airports based in Delhi. He was saying Air India have taken 5 aircraft from Delta Airlines because they've remained neutral through the event and still have access to Russian airspace. So are ramping up their frequencies between India and the United States, flying over Russian airspace, taking advantage of the Great Circle, whereas United, Delta, and American are having to take an extra 2 hours on their blocks because they need to avoid Russian airspace, and in some cases actually take a fuel penalty or payload penalty on the service. In fact, he was saying they have to park one of those airlines' aircraft on the closest stand to the active runway, so that taxiing out is minimized, so they can actually reach the ultimate destination without an en route stop. So it has all sorts of implications and cost that everyone is having to plan around and tread around. But for every airline that is disadvantaged, Air India suddenly have an opportunity they previously probably would not have considered against the major US carriers. The irony, of course, is that they'll lease aircraft from Delta Airlines, or Delta will lease aircraft to them to then take their business away from them and fly non-stop. But that's the nature of the industry.
Yeah. Well, Gary, who was one of the guests this morning, was saying he saw 2023 perhaps as the year that gives Asia Pacific the chance to catch up really with the rest of the world. The Asia Pacific's been slower recovering, and maybe unfair or fair as it is, these sort of issues will give them an advantage over the next year and allow them to catch up a bit more. There is, John, some upside, isn't there, in this new routing? You were enthusiastic about the fact that you're going to be flying this route.
Yeah, you can time travel. you can probably flip across 5 or 6 time zones in the space of 1 hour, and cross the international date line if anyone can afford to buy a ticket to travel from Tokyo to Europe.
You're going to be doing, and you're quite excited about, aren't you? All those time zones.
So if this map is right, and who am I to dispute what sort of map IATA produced, looks like you get a visit to Father Christmas at the same time as well. So quid's in, I think. Can't wait for it to happen. But 15
I'm not sure
hours.
it's an IATA map.
15 hours is a long time for, you know, what has traditionally been about an 11-hour sector maximum. Nice
view over the Arctic though.
There's only so many in-flight movies. I mean, my Netflix account's going to get swamped, I think.
Okay, let's have a look at another aspect of the market, and that's that's clearly been changing, and that's the low-cost airlines. And what we're seeing when we look at the numbers for December, certainly versus December 2019, is globally the low-cost capacity share is up 2%, which doesn't sound very much, but actually is quite a lot, really. And across most markets, most geographic regions as well. The big exception is Southern Africa, but low costs have gained market share in terms of capacity, at least, pretty much everywhere, haven't they, John?
Yeah, a couple of factors, I think, Becca. You know, obviously quicker back to market, simplified business model compared to the legacy airlines. Maybe 1, 2 different aircraft in the fleet makes it easier to operate. Multiple bases within a continent in many cases, or within a country, and you know, perhaps the best part of it all for them has been in terms of aircraft deliveries. 2022, 2023, there are lots of aircraft deliveries slated for low-cost airlines around the world. So we're going to see more and more growth into this, which is going to challenge the legacy airlines. In the US, you've got Allegiant, Frontier, and Spirit, all with 40+ aircraft being delivered next year. You've got, you know, Ryanair. I think it's certainly at least 1 a week next year. Similarly with EasyJet and Wizz, large numbers go out into Asia. There's more happening, and this is challenging short-haul travel generally. I mean, the legacy airlines, some of them have vacated markets, left it to either low-cost airlines or their low-cost partners. It's the way of the world, and if one thing's come out of the pandemic, it is that low-cost airlines are grabbing more and more share, and not just at secondary airports. You know, I think you think of airports that still are bastions of legacy airlines and are firmly locked to legacy airlines. After Heathrow, you begin to struggle to think of airports that are purely legacy carriers. And even Heathrow, you could argue Eurowings operating for Lufthansa or a low-cost airline. It's a fascinating time.
We're going to stay with low-cost theme, and for the next few slides, we've done a piece of analysis here which we thought was quite interesting, looking at the number of routes operated by Ryanair in each month since January 21, so that's over a 2-year period, and looking at from month to month how many of those routes didn't operate in a subsequent month, or they weren't operating and then they did operate, just to see the sort of level of churn. Obviously more in 2021 as things were getting back up and running, but these large increases that happen at the beginning of the summer season and then large drops at the sort of October, November time. I know this is quite extreme, isn't it? That this sort of level of seasonality, but it's particularly European phenomenon, isn't it? I think rather than not particularly South American or Asian, but it's the challenge, isn't it?
It is. You know, it's extreme, but isn't everything Ryanair do extreme? So, you know, it's just a manifestation of that. But these are really big numbers. Many of these destinations were only being served perhaps once, twice weekly. And, you know, it is clearly the impact of the beginning and the end of the summer seasons. But for airport operators, for you know, slot coordinators, it's a real challenge because suddenly big slugs of capacity become available, and airports are obviously keen to fill that. but finding those gaps in the summer months is particularly difficult as these airlines come back with their historic schedules. It's not just Ryanair, but it is a European phenomenon. And when we went back to one of the first slides, we were showing that seasonality peak that you see is quite interesting on global capacity. And I was looking at an airport this morning. It has 4% of its total yearly flights in July, and it has 16% of its annual flights in December. So how does an airport manage that very large gap in its profile of capacity and traffic on a per annum basis? You know, how do you resource for that? How do you build infrastructure for that? Very, very difficult, and something airport operators have to live with every year.
Laura, how important is seasonality for your work and how the sort of slot issues you have?
Yeah, well, I think the important piece from our side is really that the slot process allows the airlines to do this. So there's no real rigidity in the slot process that prevents you moving the schedule to reflect where the demand is. And Europe, of course, is the kind of case in point on this. But huge movement between leisure traffic in the summer and the sort of southern European markets, and then a real flip through the winter to very different flying opportunities. And then you take into account some of those aircraft obviously coming out of the schedule and managing the maintenance and things, and a smaller flying program. But the slot process has always been, I think, agile enough to allow the airlines to enter the airports, flip the schedules to react to demand very quickly. And that, of course, is what's driving the huge rebound on the short haul side and the low cost side, is being able to actually match the flying program to where the consumers wanted to fly. And in COVID, that was even more, focused on the sort of short, medium haul, and the legacy carriers were doing the same, and we saw the same in the US. But it's interesting because one of the things the EU is looking at is really prioritising slot allocation by route, and we're really opposed to this because it just puts in place a kind of rigidity that the industry's never had to deal with, and could have some really negative consequences, because it would prevent an airline being able to react to that kind of seasonal demand, because you could be forced to fly, the whole season into one destination that doesn't match where the passenger wants to fly. So charts like this, I think, are really good at giving a focus on what an agile carrier is doing to match the consumer's desires for where they want to fly.
It's also about hope as well, isn't it? I mean, for those leisure destinations where tourism is so important, it contributes such a large part of their economic activity. If they could extend or find ways to extend their product offering into the shoulder seasons, there is so much capacity available here from all of the leisure airlines that they could they get another flight or 2 more flights for another 6-week period? How much difference would that make to the tourism sector? All of those sort of things.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can jump in, but the last 2 slides, I think, myself, John, all of us, John, Becca, Lara, I think we can continue to speak just using these 2 slides for the rest of the day, and because they are very rich in terms of what means a low-cost carrier. So definitely low South America, you are considering GOL a low-cost carrier, although GOL is now clearly matching airfares from LATAM and Azul. So what means to be a low-cost carrier, right? So there is always a very difficult definition and single definition of what a low-cost carrier means. And so, of course, share of seat share might depend of our definition. But coming back to this, I think there are a few points that are worth mentioning. First is that flexibility is good, and I think in some parts of the world, including Latin, we need more flexibility. So we need more carriers that have some routes that are seasonal, and to have a graph that is closer to the air that you are showing here. So I think both Africa, Latin, because they are less developed regions in terms of aviation, we don't have typically this type of profile of routings being added and drops during low and high season. And I think this is good flexibility. But the second point is, as John was mentioning, for an airport operator and for a region and a community, if you already have your peak periods completely full, then the question is, how can we add more services on the shoulder and not off-peak periods, unless the ones that flying at peak want to extend their operation, right? Because so the example of John, so if in December you have 16% of your annual traffic, most likely there are no slots available in December. So if someone wants to use October and November, it's either one carrier that is already operating in December and adding more services in the shoulder, so in the not so peaky periods, or we cannot have a new carrier or a new service coming because that service will need to not operating at the peaks, which is of course non-viable. So I think this is what we are, of course, discussing a lot with Lara and the teams is, you know, how we can adapt ourselves to a reality which is flexibility is very good to add and to decrease and increase capacity, but at some point in time we also need to understand that communities want longer periods of services because that will of course use more wisely the resources, being at the airport level, being at the community level, leisure, hotels, convention centers, and so on. So the flexibility cannot mean at the end allowing others to entering the market if they are willing to do so for longer periods of time.
Yeah, really.
It's also, I mean, this is also highlights the whole relationship between airports and stakeholders, doesn't it? I mean, you know, what we're seeing here is so important for the stakeholders, the whole community, and yet in many cases the airport takes a very small share of the revenue from these services, and yet is the most exposed to the changes that take place in the market. And it's fascinating to begin to see some airports in Europe and some markets actually work through the airport stakeholders and tourism boards to extend the product offering into the autumn period. You know, I know in Cyprus, the Cyprus Tourism Board gave money to a number of mountain villages to create Christmas markets in Cyprus to encourage more visitors in the off-peak period. You know, how many towns in the United Kingdom now have a German market? You know, another example of product extension and rollout to other parts of Europe. And there's opportunities for many stakeholders and communities to create product that will help them get more airlift in those shoulder periods. And that might address some of the seasonality that we see. But it is a challenge, and of course some hoteliers are quite happy at the end of October to close up and disappear until April.
Yeah, I was going to say, John, if I can jump in on that, sorry to be European again, but the example of the Greek islands, I think it's a really good case in point where I think there would be extended flying outside of that sort of school holiday closure at the end of October and everyone leaving on Halloween and never returning again until the summer. But if the hoteliers would stay open, if the islands were more inviting for the tourists, actually those airports have got huge volumes of capacity available and they all go back to no slot coordination at all for the winter season. So there is huge potential to grow these markets, and we've seen that now in some of the Balearics sort of starting to extend the seasons completely throughout the winter as well.
Yeah, really, really interesting discussion. We've got another slide looking at low cost. In a nod to Harry Yao with us today, we've got a couple of slides here looking at two of the low cost carriers in Latin America. So we've got the JetSmart group, we've got Viva on the right, just showing how much they've extended their reach over the last few years. Do you want to talk, Yao, to the sort of what's happening in the low cost market in Latin America?
Yeah, no, clearly they are expanding, and I think there is the need, and I think there is the opportunity. As we were talking before, legacy carriers, they are more rigid, they need feeding, and of course with long haul operations still coming from COVID. I think these regional service, trans-border services, they are easier to implement, and also they are point-to-point in most of the cases. So when we see what is going on with JetSmart Group and with Viva Group, clearly we have a strong increase in their network. They have received a number of aircraft, and on the case of JetSmart in Argentina, also the seizing of Norwegian, which they have bought their operations, also was quite important for them to be able to establish in Argentina, especially in Buenos Aires, as a core city for them. So we are expecting this to continue. We really need more OD pairs. So we have 5 or 6 cities in the entire region that have 50 or 60 or 70% of the total demand, especially on the international side. And of course, that doesn't make any sense. So we need to be more connected. So we need to be able to make viable secondary city pairs so that people can go for short breaks or for their meetings in a timely manner. And I think that's I think where JetSmart and Viva can really step in and make their mark, because if they want to compete on Santiago, São Paulo, they will have strong competition, or Buenos Aires, São Paulo, where we have 10 airlines doing the same route. But if they do a northeast destination in Brazil to Buenos Aires, they might be just one of the 2 that is willing to do the route. And the same applies with Viva, that is now flying from Medellin to Buenos Aires and São Paulo. So when they are the only one doing that, and I think that's very important. So if they found the right spots and the right cities to connect, I think that they have a lot of room for growth, and we need that, of course, to make this region that is very big smaller, right? Because now it takes me longer to go to some places in Colombia than to get to Dubai or to anywhere in Europe, and that clearly doesn't make any sense.
No, it's a really interesting point. We've got we're going to move on and look at the US airports, but I know, John, we've looked at North America before, and some low-cost carriers do, just in their expansion, they have specifically targeted those unserved routes, haven't they? And other ones have chosen to go into the heavily congested and busy competitive markets. But it is a decision, isn't it? A strategy decision to go for some of the uncontested routes.
Yeah, and it reaches the point where how much longer can you avoid going into those big markets and competing with established carriers? And when you compete with those established carriers, you've got 2 choices. You either try and compete with a reasonable level of frequency, which means that you're going to invest a lot of asset and a lot of cost, or you go into the market with maybe a single daily frequency, and you try and buy your way into the market with very low fares, stimulating the local O&D. And probably realize that you'll never be able to move your average yields up from what they are from the first day you start. It becomes very difficult to do that. But US airports are, major US airports are ripe for low-cost entrants. We've seen that happening in Chicago at O'Hare in recent times. Frontier have built into Dallas-Fort Worth. If you look in Miami, 3 years ago, Miami didn't have any significant low-cost presence. Now it's got Southwest, and it's got JetBlue, and others joining in. So all of the major US airports are going to see increased competition from these carriers, not just on domestics as well. There's no reason with the A321 XLR and some of the orders that are in place that the whole of LATAM is not connected to the United States and the key markets, and particularly the secondary LATAM cities. Those places in Northeast Brazil, for instance, are ripe for services to Miami or Fort Lauderdale or Orlando, where capacity exists and they can be accommodated.
We've had a question in from Stephen Len. Is growth in the LCCs primarily a result of increased leisure demand versus a drop in business travellers, or are we seeing business travellers moving to LCCs? Is that?
I think it's a combination of both. There is undoubtedly a group of leisure business travellers who are now flying LCCs. You know, small independent people who quite frankly see that it's better value for money. And on many occasions, there's better frequency with the low-cost carriers than there is with legacy airlines. So it works better. Many of the established low-cost airlines are creating frequent flyer programs. They're creating added benefits for those people who are regular travelers on their networks, you know, and they're rewarding loyalty. So that they're appealing to the business market. And a classic, I think, is where LARA is. I mean, Geneva, London, Gatwick, EasyJet, 60+% business travelers, I think.
Yeah, huge amount. Yeah, and then I think it's the merging of the hybridness of all those models. You know, there's extremes on each end, but actually there's not a huge differentiation now between the middle range of low-cost carriers, short-haul carriers, regional carriers, particularly in a lot of these areas like JetBlue. You talk about, you know, bridging now over into the UK and now announced into Paris. The offering they have is obviously at a different price point, but actually the service and things, you know, you're on a point-to-point service essentially into that North American market. So it's interesting to see that for us, particularly in the slots area, I think that the congested airports are now getting targeted by a lot of the low-cost carriers, and they're being able to enter and bring that competition and choice in and change the route network that's offered from the airports.
Yeah, and I guess where the legacy carriers now are unbundling fares, the difference in product doesn't feel as different, does it, to the consumer?
No. And there is better product also in some of the low-cost carriers on some of the narrow bodies. So we are seeing larger pitch on the front rows. We are seeing even live flatbeds in some of the 737 MAX. So I think, you know, we have products for all the needs, and I think that is as John mentioned, we are in a hybrid. So we might have less corporate, but we might have some small companies that found that, yeah, they can pay slightly cheaper prices if they go even on a business class, but in a slightly different carrier. And if we see, for instance, JetBlue with a Mint product, what does it mean at the end, right? What is the Mint product on business class? So is that a hybrid business class? It's a more low cost. It's, you know, I think the price range it starts to be very, very competitive, and I think that we'll need to bring an answer from the legacy carriers and the other carriers to respond to that.
Okay, let's move on slightly. One of the questions we often look at is, I guess over the last few years, we've been surprised how few airlines have failed and continue to be surprised. Actually, maybe we don't. We've been in the industry too long. How many new airlines there are, how many people there are who still want to set up an airline. So we had a look at how many airlines appear to be in the schedule this month versus December 2019. We did put a little bit of a threshold in because we wanted to get rid of the long tail of very, very small airlines, but that threshold was only a sort of a flight a week. And these are the numbers we have. Still huge numbers of airlines, isn't there, John? I mean, I know you and I have talked about this before, that in most industries, there's some sort of convergence to three big players, and we have 3 airline alliances, and actually we've got a question about alliances that we might come to, but there's not 3 big airlines, are there?
I mean, you know, even in the world of motor car manufacturers, you know, there's probably no more than a dozen global manufacturers. Yeah, we have 800+ airlines filing scheduled services this week somewhere around the world. It's crazy, and obviously government rules, regulations, ownership structures, all of these sort of things. The belief that airlines are part of national defence systems, whatever, it just makes me laugh sometimes. What makes me laugh even more though, Becca, is there's all these airlines. Last week's IATA Open House talked about 2023 airline profitability. You know, and the hope that the industry will return to profitability next year, and it will because 6 or 7 airlines in North America will make tremendous profits. 4 or 5 in Europe, including Ryanair, who are non-IATA, will make good profits. The Middle East carriers will make good profits because their accountants always make sure they make good profits, and Singapore Airlines will make profit because the Singapore government makes sure they make a profit every year. But we're probably talking that less than half of 1% of airlines account for 70 or 80 or even 90% of the industry profitability, and the rest survive on cash flow and by charming their bank managers probably twice a year. And it's wrong. It just doesn't compute with normal, commercial business sense. Some of the world's greatest entrepreneurs have started airlines and lost billions, and that will continue. And of course, the barriers to entry at the moment are lower than they've ever been, and getting slots at what were constrained airports has been easier than it has been for decades. And although we all encourage and want competition, you sometimes wonder whether there are just too many airlines flying around the world. And from an airport's perspective, how do you deal with 264 potential customers in Latin America?
That's a good question. I only have 30 something, so I'm 230 missing airlines.
You're failing. Get out there and get more airlines
to come. So you are the other 200 are more than welcome to come. Yeah, I mean, I think numbers are always very impressive, but I think it's also the size of each one that makes some of the difference. So in Latin, we have basically 2.5, let's say, be friendly to the airlines, 3 airlines that can compete on the long haul stage. So if it's only 3, right, and we have more than 300 million people living in Latin, and we have home-based carriers in Latin America, 3 carriers that can even compete on the world stage of long-haul operations, and so I mean the numbers are very important, but it's more about seat share of the largest 3 to 5 carriers. Let's make it 10. In big markets, I think that is what drives competition, because you might have very small carriers, niche carriers in some of the islands, Caribbean islands, or in Europe, in some of the remote parts. But at the end, they are very specific. They target some markets. That's fine. But for the overall competition, even at the congested airports, what we see from the most slot-constrained airports is that one carrier typically dominates close to half of the slots. And if we go to the peak times of the day, sometimes even more than half of the slots. So does it mean that we have true competition in those highly disputed city centers or airports? I think that's the question. And at the end, we need to be able to give those answers as an industry. And I always say to Lara that is as an industry together that we can find the right solutions.
Yeah, really, really helpful. Yeah. We've got a couple more slides before we finish. The next one, we wanted to look forward a bit into 2023. Lots of well discussed and covered headwinds, really. What I've shown here is some IMF GDP projections, just showing how much lower GDP economic growth is looking like it will be in the next year compared to the last year or 2021. Lots of other pressures on the industry. What are your thoughts, each of you, on the next year really for the industry? Has 2022 been the sort of the dress rehearsal for recovery proper, or is it going to be a really tight, really hard 6 months?
Well, I'm all for more discipline. I think the more capacity discipline we see going through 2023, then the better it's going to be for the industry. And we'll be able to ride out all of these headwinds. We're beginning to see for the first month, looks like inflation may have peaked in some markets and it's going to come back down. Obviously price of fuel spiked in the last couple of days as the weather in the northern hemisphere has deteriorated. But generally, I think next year looks pretty positive. If we get, and we will get through the first quarter of 2023, we'll see more markets opening in Asia. We'll see some more resource and more capacity coming online, but not significant volumes, and it will be well managed. And you know, hopefully, if we see China reopening in the second half, last quarter of the year, it all looks, I think, quite positive. It's just a matter of that discipline staying in the market and no one disrupting it to a point where it provokes the wrong type of reaction in terms of capacity. Yes, fares are going to be high. You know, if you know when you want to travel in 2023 and you've got the cash, best to book as soon as you possibly can, I think. And I've said that all the way through the pandemic. You know, you're going to get a bargain now for 6 months' time. In 5 months' time, that airfare could be very expensive.
Laura, what are your thoughts about the next year?
I know we're sort of, the latest outlook that IATA's put out is that, you know, next year's going to see some growth, but it's going to pull back down on what the growth we've seen this year. And Asia obviously has some room to go in there. But I think for us, the big question mark from a sort of slots capacity demand balancing point of view is the dress rehearsal that you mentioned last year, or this year. You know, let's hope that really wasn't a dress rehearsal for some of the queues and the nightmares we may see next year again. And that was the full, you know, finale of that. But I think we are a bit concerned that actually we were still operating at quite a, as John's word, disciplined level this summer, and next summer with the Northern Hemisphere peak, if we really are truly back to full schedules, which the slot rules sort of coming back to normal would indicate that you've got to put these full sort of flying programs in, there is concern out there that the supply side isn't ready, that some of these resource issues on the supply side were probably masked a bit this year. And whether they'll be back, you know, ATC, airports, ground handling, airlines themselves, is everyone really ready to get back to full capacity? So actually being very carefully, managing that growth carefully is going to be key, so that we don't fall over again like we saw this summer.
Any airports you can specifically think of, Laura, that you'd like to share? Well,
I suppose the obvious one, Amsterdam, you know, absolute headache for everyone.
I thought there was another one.
And will be an absolute headache anyway next year because of this permanent cap they're trying to put in place. So even if the temporary issues move away, we've all got to deal with what's coming at the end of the year anyway, in a permanent reduction, and try and manage that. So I think that's the problem. As we're coming back to normal, there's so many other headwinds with the airspace issues, government sort of approaches on noise, environment, and other areas. We're all going to be very busy still.
And I think that's a really interesting point. It's, you know, it's almost as though the regulators have had nothing to do for 2 years other than create inconvenience and come up with crazy ideas. Like, you know, banning domestic flights in France less than 2.5 hours. Step in Lufthansa, KLM and British Airways and they'll carry those passengers on an international flight. Not a problem. I mean, the law of unintended consequences, you know, it hits us straight away. And there's, yeah, you just feel that, I mean, Amsterdam, London's third airport, has been so successful, and KLM's whole business model is built on 6 freedom traffic flows, and now is going to be compromised by the changes in rules and regulations that they're being asked to impose. It's sad when airlines and airports are trying to recover their businesses and the regulator appears to do everything to frustrate them in their best efforts.
Yeah, can you be more positive? So that's a fairly, it feels like a fairly bleak view from Europe, but are things looking more positive in Latin America for 2023?
Yeah, I mean, the last quarter was positive, and I think we are, and I think we will continue first, second quarter of 23 on a positive note, recovery. So the numbers that we see from capacity, they are very encouraging. Of course, then we have this economic situation. I think it's a world one that we need to see what is going on. I mean, the exchange rates for Latin is also an issue. the fuel prices. So if we put fuel price in dollars, we have aircraft leasing in dollars. So sometimes the exchange rate might play a role here in terms of how we can recover and how fast we can recover. But I think at the moment, the signals that we see, they are positive. The capacity is there. The willingness of people to travel is there. So I think we're going to the new year on the positive side.
That's good. We have one more slide to have a look at, and it's sort of a bit of fun, but it's also got a serious point. OEG, if you haven't found it, is on Twitter and quite often puts out dynamic little charts that move and prove quite popular. We put some data together for OEG that looked at the scheduled flying to Lapland. There's 4 airports, of which Rovaniemi is the biggest one, just to see how much capacity, scheduled capacity, there is going into Lapland for Christmas. And obviously there's a peak at Christmas, but we were just we were really interested to see how long they've extended their season. So if ever there was a destination that you thought was time sensitive, as in it's about Christmas, and visiting Santa Claus, actually it seems that you can visit Santa Claus all the way through till March. So it's a really interesting example, successful example, I guess, of a destination that has found a way to extend its season.
And changes the way that its traffic is comprised. I mean, there's a lot more scheduled services being operated there, whereas it used to be a charter market. There used to be a lot of Chinese and Russian travelers up there. Finnair had a great connecting product from Asia up there, and the Rovaniemi Tourism Board actually attended trade events in Asia to promote the destination and the Christmas product. But they've flipped and they found more market in other parts of the world, and principally in Europe. And it just, if every destination was able to be as creative as they've been in extending their product into shoulder periods and over the half-term holidays in February, then it would be great to see that happening elsewhere. Yeah,
really, it's really good fun. If you haven't found those on Twitter, do have a look. And I think in the chat area, one of our colleagues has put information about the, particularly John's blogs, but I write blogs as well for OEG, just keeping people up to date with what's happening in the market. We will be sending out a short survey. I think it's just got 2 questions after this, so please do fill that in if you get a moment. It's really to see if there's other topics that you'd like us to cover over the next year or so. We've been running the webinars now for, well, since about March 2020, and mostly we focus on demand and capacity. But it's we're aware that many OEG customers are involved in other aspects of aviation, and so do let us know what you think would be good to cover in these webinars as we go forward. And if you're a budding panelist and you think you'd have something to contribute, let us know as well, because we're always looking for some new panelists as well. But for today, we're really grateful to have had Lara and Yao join us. Thank you very much indeed. We hope you have a very good Christmas. Thanks for all your insights. I think we've gone past the 4 o'clock, so I'm not going to ask for closing thoughts. I think we've already talked about 2023, but thank you both for joining us today, and thank you, John, as well, with your Christmas jumper. We'll be back on January the 18th for the next webinar. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Happy Christmas, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.